All right, well, we're at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for attending DIME's July webinar. I am Rachel Chassie, DIME's Director of Innovation, and I am joined today by Rowlett Abdullahi, Clinical Research Director at Sanofi, Jen Horenjeff, Founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative, and we'll be talking today about science as justice, systemic racism, how it persists in science and medicine, and what we can all do about it. Before we get started, let's do some quick housekeeping. Please note that today's session is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be made available after today's live session. And as with all DIME events, the fun happens with the live Q&A we'll have at the end of the presentation today. So if you have a question, do feel free to raise your hand in the participant window, and I will unmute you for you to ask your question live. That's always a wild west when the fun happens. Or of course, do feel free to type your question into the chat, and we'll hopefully get to as many questions as we can today. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's introduce our esteemed panel of guests today. Rowlett, would you mind starting and getting yourself introduced?
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, DIME, for having this very important webinar. My name is Dr. Rowlett Abdullahi. It's a mouthful, but it's phonetic. I am a board-certified internal medicine, pulmonary medicine, and critical care medicine physician. I also have a background in biomedical informatics and digital health. Currently, I'm a clinical research director at Sanofi, which is a Paris-based pharmaceutical company. In my role, I help develop the strategy for the clinical trials, as well as work to implement within the immunoinflammation division digital health strategies. I look forward to our discussion today on this very important topic of racism in science and medicine.
Thanks, Rowlett. We're excited to have you. Jen, do you care to jump in and give an introduction on yourself and Savvy Co-op?
Yeah, happily. So I'm Jen Horenjeff, the founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative. And Savvy is actually a patient-owned public benefit co-op. There's another mouthful, a mouthful of awesomeness, we like to think. And what we do is help to connect companies and innovators directly with diverse patients for the purposes of getting their input into either user experience, market research, or getting their input on clinical science and research design there. My personal background is as a patient myself. I was diagnosed as an infant with many different autoimmune conditions, most notably juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Also had a brain tumor removed about 7.5 years ago now. And I wanted to go into healthcare to be able to help other patients that are trying to manage their life and be able to fit managing their care into their day-to-day activities. So I became a human factors engineer and human-centered designer, and then went on to get my PhD in technically environmental medicine, although my focus was in patient-centered outcomes. And so how can we, understand the health and health behaviors of different individuals beyond just the clinical markers that we might be measuring, so that we can understand how their priorities fit into either treatment guidelines, clinical trial protocols, et cetera. Was also an FDA advisor, serving as a consumer representative for them as well, and really saw sort of what my professional colleagues were talking about did not always align with what patients were wanting and needing, and really needing to make sure that we hear those diverse voices and not just asking the same people over and over again. And so therefore, I'm very excited to be here and talking about this super important topic.
Man, I am so excited to be talking with you both about this. I'm really excited. Thanks again for making the time to be a part of this, and thanks for everyone on the line. Let's go ahead and get started. So I think by now we have all seen this data from the New York Times, and it looks like despite taking more precautions than white people, Black and Latinx folks are more affected by the pandemic in the United States. Now, there's many factors at play here that we don't have time to get into in today's webinar. It's multifaceted, as we all know. But this is yet again another reminder of the inequity in our society and also in healthcare. But why are we talking about this? Well, because as every scientist knows, ignoring the facts doesn't make them go away. And if you don't know the history of racism in science and medicine, you can't be part of the solution. So let's take some time to talk about that. How has there been systemic racism in science and medicine? One example is that, well, some pioneers of science have had problematic ideologies, to say the least. And I don't include this slide to discredit statistics, but instead to use it as a reminder for all of us to continually examine our work through an ethical lens, to not accept things as the status quo and just accept things straight out. We need to be looking at the tools that we use, our outputs, the products that we develop, and to continually ask ourselves, is this helping people? And where do these outputs provide power? Do we help the most marginalized, or do we continue to help people who have historically always been helped? Something else too is that, well, modern gynecology was born straight out of racism when experiments were conducted on enslaved women, clearly without their consent or even without anesthesia. And I was planning on including more quotes and more commentary on this slide, but a lot of the information is really so gruesome, and I hope you can forgive me for not putting that information on the slide. And sometimes when we talk about this, or racism in general, there's a lot of rhetoric that goes along that says that racism is a thing of the past. And as we can see here from the NIH's website on HeLa cells from Henrietta Lacks, the website doesn't even mention the problematic history with the usage of HeLa cells. And this speaks to a main point that I'd like to make today, is that with instances like this, with the NIH's website, there is a refusal of science to grapple with its racist history. And like we mentioned before, ignoring the facts doesn't make them go away. If we don't talk about racism in science and medicine, we can't acknowledge that some of these beliefs are rooted in racism, and we can't dispel these racist beliefs that persist today. So this study here on the screen was conducted just 4 years ago and shows how racist beliefs that were created by enslavers to justify the mistreatment of enslaved people, still exist today. These racist beliefs are associated with healthcare outcomes. Essentially, racism hurts patients. Now, I don't include this slide to shame these white medical students, but instead show how racist beliefs have become normalized and accepted as fact. And to reinforce that by talking about racism, that it's necessary for all disciplines of science and medicine if we want to see change. I'll take a quick little detour here to make a slight shift and take a moment to reflect on how 70% of people in the United States who are in STEM are white. And so when the majority of scientists have a homogeneous background, how can we be sure that science is asking the right questions? Is it possible that there could be a natural lack of insight driving research agendas? And this is a difficult and uneasy question, but we continue to see outcomes like this, about how some medical products work differently for white patients and white people as opposed to people of color. And we continue to see things like this. And at the end of the day, it's our choice if we allow racial bias to continue or not. And if we don't want it to continue, we have to talk about it. So let's get to why a lot of us are here today. How does this systemic racism in science and medicine affect patients? And so as we all know, there is terrible underrepresentation of minority patients in clinical research. This slide is being presented while also acknowledging that it's not fully representative. This slide has no mention of Asian Americans or Native Americans and so on. In fact, I'm willing to bet that Native American representation in clinical trials is potentially less than that of the Latinx population. But this doesn't take away from the truth of the matter. And so might there be a relationship between these numbers, the fact that Black or African American people only make up 5% of clinical trial participants, or that Latinx people only make up 1% of clinical trial participants? Are those numbers perhaps, is there a relationship between them and the fact that 70% of people working in STEM are white? Would diversity of thought on a research team help these numbers in a positive way? And so this gets to this statement here that POC are underrepresented in science, both as those in power as researchers and as those potentially benefiting from medical breakthroughs. So there's a lot of heavy stuff that we just presented, and I don't want to leave us all deflated, right? Because the good news is that there's lots that each of us can do to begin ending systemic racism if we allow ourselves to get to work. Let's talk about that. So what can we do at our jobs, right? So the good news is that there's lots that we can do to all reach a more equitable place. And a great place to start is by doing a Google search. There's lots of excellent resources out there available from high quality sources, all of them better than me. So take a look and see what works for your team, your company, your lab, your colleagues, and see what can work. And also bring your colleagues into the conversation, because this is not something to be solved by one person in one place. So this right here is a publication about 10 things to do for a lab to get to a better future. Now, this is an example of what can happen in a lab, but many, if not all of these, can also be applied to a workplace. And the bottom line here is that there is so much that we can each do if we become more intentional about inclusivity. Okay, so here's the content that we all came here for. What can we do for patients? And this is the kind of work that we thought exactly that Jen would be excellent by bringing in some feedback from Savvy Co-op and working with herself and other patient groups, and also Rowlett too, working in the space, reaching patients through at Sanofi as well. But a great place to start about how we can help patients is simply just to talk to patients, especially underrepresented patients during every step of product development. Now, whenever I say underrepresented patients, here we're looking at things through a racial lens, but as we all know, healthcare affects people differently, and underrepresented can mean a lot of things. It can mean people living in rural areas. It can mean people who don't speak English, immigrants, refugees, people who perhaps have rheumatoid arthritis and can't hold the phone very easily to use a lot of these really innovative medical products. So it's really important to get patient feedback on every step of product development. Simply, patients know best how to reach their community. It's also the first step towards meaningful patient engagement. Any more comments maybe from Jess or Rowlett about this? Jen or Rowlett about this? My goodness.
I mean, I have lots of comments about this, but I can certainly wait till we get into the thick of it. But I appreciate you elevating this up to understand that, you know, the best way that we're going to understand the needs of patients is to actually ask them. We don't need to guess. That's the beauty of it, is you don't have to sit in your room and just think about what they want and need. You can actually talk to them. And I think we can have an interesting conversation as well about why some, especially pharmaceutical companies or highly regulated parts of the industry, sometimes get nervous talking to patients, but understanding that there are actually ways that we can and should continue to talk to patients, that it will just make things accelerate faster in order to get those more inclusive solutions to the patients.
And just to add on to what Jen has said, it's important in order for us to get to these patients to ensure that we have representatives from these patient populations who are in the industry or who are on the clinical trial sites, representatives who understand the community from both a racial and ethnic perspective, but also from a different lens, such as the location perspective, such as patients in rural areas. So it is very important for us to make sure that we are inclusive in the people that we also hire to carry out some of these discussions, because there is, and I'll speak about it later on, something to be said about cultural congruence or concordance that allows patients to feel that they are getting a quote unquote personal touch. And that will be important to be able to show the patients that you do recognize that they do have needs that may not be specifically addressed by the general cookie cutter pathways or patterns that we usually use.
I think to your point, it's very important to talk about how are we reaching these patients. And I think from a company or organizational standpoint, you know, making sure that you have people employed that are able to, you know, connect with these individuals in a way that may be more culturally sensitive. Also, how are we reaching those patients? That's something that we focus a lot on making sure there is peer-to-peer outreach that feels like it's, you know, again, more somebody from your peer group that is reaching out in those culturally sensitive and appropriate ways, because just because somebody's a patient doesn't mean that they know what the other patient group needs. And so just really being in tune with the fact that there are a diverse set of needs and therefore a diverse set of ways that we want to reach those different populations.
Yeah, I think that's great too. It's also going back to the idea that it might be hard to reach patients, as we all know, it can be hard to reach diverse groups. And there is a lot of distrust towards science that, frankly, I think is well-founded. But it's our responsibility as people who are in science and medicine to do the work, to hear these people, and to start changing that trust. We can do that. We can get more trust from other groups if we do the work, just in ways that Jen and Rella have been mentioning.
And Rachel, I think you touch on something really important about the perception being that it's hard to reach these patients. But, you know, as somebody who does this work day in and day out, it's not. Like, if you actually create these relationships and you work with folks that understand what this outreach methods look like, then it's not difficult. And that's really kind of the barrier we want to break down, is this sort of fear that, oh, it's too hard and I don't know how to do it, so I'm just not going to do it. And I think that that's where we get stuck, and that's when we get into trouble, if we think that it's just, you know, insurmountable and then we just move on.
And actually, medicine itself has a lot of work to do. Research America performed a survey on the participation in clinical trials, trying to see how well the average American views participating in clinical trials. Most Americans are actually introduced to clinical trials through their physicians. And in that survey, they actually found fewer Black Americans and Hispanic Americans were introduced to clinical trials by their physicians. So from a medicine standpoint, we also have to do a better job of really informing our patients, because the patient-provider relationship is a very intimate one, and one in which you can have these deeper level discussions, of course, given time. And because if you build a trust with your patients along the way, you then are able to overcome some of those fears related to participating in clinical trials or in research. And so, as Jen pointed out, that's a very important thing to be able to address the trust issue. And so having that relationship with your provider who provides you that background information is probably the best way to get patients involved.
Absolutely. And we'll get to that a little bit more in a couple of slides too, but that's exactly right. And we're talking about working with clinicians and physicians here. And I think it's also something to look at from the greater clinical trial world and how those are built out. One way to look at diversity in clinical research is to look at our trial sites. You know, are the sites that your company historically contracts with delivering poor metrics on the diversity of their patients? Probably, maybe, right? Now, if that is what we continually get, then let's challenge ourselves to find new sites that reach the patients that we need, the patients that are historically underrepresented in clinical research. Right now, I mentioned contracting, right? And that's often a reason that creates more difficulty and more friction when it comes to accessing more diverse patients. But I think that this is something that is necessary, right? And together, we can lift the standards in clinical research by having much more having more sites to give us things that we really need.
Yes, so the Tufts Clinical Research Center actually touched upon this, that this was an important also factor in terms of getting patients in. And as I can go further into, the patient-provider concordance is one of the reasons that this occurs. So there have been multiple research studies performed that have shown that patients are able to, when they are able to relate more to the provider, to their physician, they're able to actually feel respected, as well as utilize primary care and preventative services. Why is this important, that patients utilize primary and preventative care services? Well, if they utilize these services and we're able to detect disease early and able to treat patients early, much of the downstream effects of these diseases can be mitigated. and it will reduce healthcare costs. So it actually benefits all of society for us to be able to hear the patients and to be able to carry out some of these desires from patients and patients groups. Again, both doctors and researchers are human. We practice through our own lens. We bring our own worldview into each experience. So having homogeneous populations of doctors and scientists and principal investigators limits the potential of science itself, and actually limits the potential of discovery and the potential for medicine to actually be more curative and preventative. So in the first study in the upper left corner, this was done by Soma Saha and colleagues. They looked at over 2,000 patients, Black, white, and Latino, and they evaluated whether or not the relationships with their providers, so patient providers, over long term, specifically providers who were of the same race as the patient, whether or not that actually influenced the outcomes for the patients, specifically their satisfaction and their use of preventative services. And lo and behold, there were higher levels of satisfaction with healthcare provided in terms of respect, the patients feeling respected, the patients feeling that they were listened to, and the patients feeling that their problems were explained in a satisfactory manner when there was patient-provider concordance. Furthermore, for Black patients who had Black physicians, they were more likely to utilize preventative care services. And when we talk about concordance or congruence, here in this context, we're talking about race or ethnicity, but then it can also be gender. On the left side, my colleagues and I at the Mayo Clinic, when I was a resident, we performed a study looking at provider and interpreter preferences for Somali women who were mostly immigrants to the Minnesota area. And we did find that actually gender concordance was very important for patients in order for them to be able to utilize, again, preventative care, specifically the discussions around mammograms and pap smears and all of those preventative tools that we have in our tool bag were easily executed when there was more gender concordance. And so the lack of cultural practices also influenced this. So it was not just being able to have gender concordance, but also being able to understand the cultural practices in that community. And then finally, if you look at the bottom here, it was a research study done by Shaba George and her colleagues. And I actually refer to this research for clinical, when I talk about diversity in clinical trials all the time, because it lays out both the barriers as well as the facilitators. It's a great article. It identified for clinical trials that, again, mistrust is an issue, and it's a barrier to participation in clinical trials for patients who are Black, Asian, and Hispanic. And that cultural congruence was seen as an important facilitator of actually improving these groups' participation in clinical trials. And this means really having the presence of staff who understand the patients and who come from these racial and ethnic groups. Again, what we talked about earlier, having that personal touch. Going back to your worldview, the ability for the patients to see someone who looks like them at the site, the appropriate language services as well, because we are a diverse nation. We are also a nation of immigrants. And so having language services so patients can speak in their native tongue, that is also important. And also reaching out beyond the traditional venues. I'm sure Jen will talk about this. Oftentimes, we are focused on, very high performing clinical trial sites or very high performing, academic centers, but these may not be where the patients are really coalesced or where the patients are getting their medical information. It could be from smaller groups such as their churches, or it could be from their barbershops. I mean, you've seen some of the studies and heard about this. So we really have to, again, come to where the patients are, because in the end, we can miss out on major opportunities. drugs such as tyrosine kinases were found to work more effectively in Asian women. We also know that heart failure combinations, certain heart failure combinations can work better in patients of African descent. So we're missing opportunities for discovery, for cure, for effective medicines when we're not addressing the concerns of the patients and coming to where they're at. This doesn't mean we need to, every Black patient needs to have a Black physician, but it means that we do need to make efforts to improve the diversity of the staff, improve the diversity of physicians, of all healthcare providers. We also need to provide better education to to patients, to providers who are white or who are in majority groups, in order to provide them with how they can be more culturally aware and have this cultural competence, as I say, when they're interacting with their patients, because it's vitally important that we get to the root of this problem. And so these articles have provided quite a bit of solutions on improving that through patient-provider concordance.
Thanks, Roland. I think the information that you say here is very, I mean, it's supported by science, right? And so we can say that it's hard to do these things, but it's also very necessary. And that also gets us to our last slide here before we go into Q&A. And that it's hard, right? Accessing diverse patient populations and supporting minority colleagues is hard. It comes with historical challenges, but science has never been about what's easy. So while we do say and recognize that reaching diverse patients are hard, science have also done really incredible, difficult things too, like gene therapy, right? Curing a disease with an injection. We've also developed an artificial pancreas, right? We can do difficult things. And if we can do all of that, surely we can reach our friends and our neighbors and our loved ones. We just have to care enough to do it, make it a priority, and allow us to get to work. And together, if we can do all of that, we can position science as a tool for justice. I think in the past, it's been used as something to not help people as well as we hope, but we can change that moving forward. Okay, well, here we are with our Q&A portion here. Just a reminder for everyone to please feel free to ask your questions. We can unmute you. We can ask them. You can ask them live, or also feel free to have some questions in the Q&A portion. But while we're giving a little bit more time for people to digest what we're presenting here, let's do a little bit more commentary. Jen, you and Savvy put together a really great white paper about patient engagement, say also within the pharma companies. I know you have a lot of work in this space. Would you like to have some more commentary about this topic at hand?
Sure, thanks for that. Yes, I mean, last year we had conducted a white paper about patient engagement and patient centricity in the life sciences, so biotech and pharma. And what we did was we actually interviewed people in the industry. We allowed them to remain anonymous, so they gave us some, really nitty-gritty details. And we also then surveyed patients as well to get their perspective on the industry. And I think that some of the things that we kept hearing on the industry side was around some of these challenges around, we don't necessarily know what it means to be patient-centered anymore. The term is thrown out there so much that we kind of feel like we have to use the term, but it doesn't really hold any sort of weight anymore. But I think to your point around, this ease of reaching patients, I think the actual technical mechanics of doing it, we've been able to solve some of these problems. I think from some of the challenges, honestly, what we can see as some of the issues is people aren't putting their money where their mouth is that there's a lot of people that talk about it, but these things take resources. And so if you are not empowering your teams or your individuals who are supposed to do this work with a budget, that's where then it falls flat. And we believe very much so in equitably valuing patients for their contributions. And so a lot of this expectation that patients are just contributing and giving their insights and input for free out of altruism, while that is a main motivation, it also is hindering diversity of participation in these opportunities. If you have to take off work on a Tuesday afternoon at 2 p.m. to be able to participate in something that allows you to give input, then that's just not going to be accessible. It also, as we've already mentioned, diversity is not just around race and ethnicity, but also thinking about different parts of the country where people are living. And a lot of that in-person sort of, face-to-face, although it doesn't happen anymore at all, but what's happening in, New York, San Francisco, and Boston. And those are not diverse perspectives either. We really need to make sure that we're connecting with people outside of, these major cities to understand what are the needs, what are the differences, what can we do to support those communities that just haven't had a voice. And so what I'm excited and thrilled to be seeing more of in light of the pandemic, while I don't like the occasion for it, is leaning into more virtual ways to collect patient insights, because we are able to be more inclusive. We are allowed to have asynchrony of getting input so that patients are able to do it on their own timing, when they're put kids to bed and finally are able to catch their breath and are logging on to, complete a survey or participate in a discussion board later in the evening or schedule interviews on their own time. I think there's a variety of ways that we can collect patient input, and it's just trying to also think about those mechanisms for doing so in ways that match the populations that you're trying to reach. And I'll also say from the patient side of that white paper, for anybody that's interested, happy to share that. But what was interesting for those listening in is that the patients who had actually worked with the industry in some capacity, had some touch point, had been asked by the industry for their input, had a more favorable view of the industry as a whole, which really should come as no surprise that if we can humanize and show that the industry actually cares, then it, starts to soften sort of this image that has been built up. And when we think about the diversity and the history of what we have done to certain communities, as in the name of science, as you had articulated so well early on in this discussion, there are other ways to engage patients and to get them involved in research that is not clinical trials. And that's what I think, that it doesn't have to be binary. It's not all or nothing, that you either don't engage in research or you have to put your body on the line to be experimented on. And so, what are other ways, either through surveys or other qualitative research, that is very low risk, but helps to show people and give people, which is empowering to know that you can actually make a difference. And that way there's a menu of options for engagement, so people can engage in a way that feels appropriate for them. And then they can start to see if they want to, try a variety of other ways.
Sorry, I had some muting issues. Jen, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think one of the things that you say that is something that I hope that we can all take away from this is that your comments about how just simply accessing some patients, that access alone is what really helped change the idea of science and medicine and pharma with patients, with people, right? And so I think sometimes we're caught with the, well, why should my company do this, do all that work, do all these research, spend all that money to help patients, whenever we're not the only people who benefit, everyone else benefits too. But that's exactly what we should be doing. If we all were to take these steps to do these things, we would all help, we would help everyone. We would help patients feel more trustworthy with science. We would get more information to make our products even better. So I think that while it may be difficult, it's possible, and especially in this digital age, right? You are listening to a webinar with the Digital Medicine Society. I would imagine people who are on this webinar are a bit more tech savvy, future forward thinking than maybe perhaps more traditional product development. There's really interesting ways for us to do this in the future, and ways that Jen has mentioned too. We do have a really great question from the chat from Cindy Gagan. She is a patient advocate extraordinaire and a very dear friend at Dine. Cindy, are you able to ask your question to us live?
Yeah, so I'm on, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
So thank you for doing this on this important topic, and your overview was terrific. And Jen, I fully appreciated your comment about investing in this. So my background started, I'm a breast cancer survivor, but I started doing cancer research outreach probably 25 years ago, and it was in inner city Baltimore. So I have a lot of experience with this racism and research and methods to kind of address it. But I think it's even harder now, and it's not in your slides. I'm hoping we can come up with a solution, but the racism and the inequity in healthcare more broadly and social determinants of health. So how can you separate research participation when you have people who cannot access quality care for the things that they need?
Thanks, Cindy. That's a great question, very important one. Thank you for asking it to us. I think your question is how do we separate these things? I'm not sure that we can, and I'm not sure that that's a way to go about thinking of it. I think there's all these different ways that these things intersect that I'm not sure we can remove, separate these things, right? People who are affected by racism, and it's a lot of us, it's most of us, we can't separate our existence from the racism that we've experienced and how that's permeated into ourselves, right? That's just existing in this world. Just the same way that I can't separate my existence as a woman from moving forward, right? But I think it's something that's useful for us to think about, that racism is multifaceted. It affects people in very different ways. It affects society, healthcare, everything, housing access to education in different ways, right? And so whenever we try and move forward and look at how can we make healthcare, looking at this webinar, how can we make healthcare more equitable? We need to realize that people are coming to this conversation, looking at things, living their lives with different experiences. And so whenever we start to address, how can we address social determinants of health, access to quality healthcare, all these different things, I'm not sure we can separate it. I think that all that we can do is move forward, acknowledging that these things exist together and that we have to talk about all things, right? Now, a lot of this conversation on this webinar is about how can we address diverse populations within clinical trials, but that's just one aspect of it. Jen and Rowlett have mentioned it's multifaceted, it affects a lot of different things too. So I think when we try and move forward in this space, we have to realize that people are coming to the conversation with a lot. And so we can look at racism in research, racism in accessing patient care, healthcare coverage, but a lot of these things intersect. And it makes things much more multifaceted and difficult to move forward with. But I think that's just the nature of the space that we are existing in. Rowlett, Jen, any?
Yes, I wanted to just jump in. So great question, Cindy. And as Rachel said, this is all intertwined. When a Black research participant is being part of a clinical trial, they still experience all the same racism they experience as being a non-Black participant, a Black participant not in a trial. So none of those things go away. And this cuts across socioeconomic bounds because of the health effects of racism that really affects Black people, whether they're rich or whether they're poor. So it's all intertwined. But we, as purveyors of research, we actually have to invest more. And so one of the solutions, it will be taking this moment, taking this time to really deliver justice, to really deliver the full breadth of what we can deliver from a research perspective. And why do I say justice? So 40 years ago, the Belmont report was published. And you guys may know the Belmont report stemmed from years of research and analysis, mostly because of the Tuskegee experiment, the very cruel experiments on Black men in the South. And from that Belmont report, there were 3 basic ethical principles of research. Respect for persons, so making sure people have autonomy and protecting those who have diminished autonomy. Beneficence, so doing no harm and trying to maximize benefit. And also justice, which is the fair treatment and basically equal distribution of benefits. We have yet to establish and achieve justice because we have not been able to fairly distribute the benefits of research. The people who are mostly recruited for clinical trials are white. The people who, most of the outcomes are done, are performed on regarding different medications are majority white. We may be missing both efficacy markers as well as safety markers when we don't include people of different races and ethnicities in a large enough number in these clinical trials. So it is upon us to fulfill the ethical principles of research and ensure there's justice here. And so this is why one of the solutions has to be investing more in the outreach to minority communities, investing more in ensuring that the staff represents a diverse communities. This can no longer be an either or question. It has to be a must in clinical trials. And I think the FDA is moving towards that. They've made comments on diversity in clinical trials in the past. And I think pharmaceutical companies are stepping up to look at these concerns and to address these concerns. But again, there's a whole, I guess, chain of the clinical trial process or product development process, all the way from developing the clinical trials to actually the sites level. So there are many different levels in a clinical trial, and we have to address diversity, and we have to address equal treatment and equity at each level, because we can't cut off what's happening in society with what's happening in research.
Thank you. That was excellent. I guess my point really is the trust that's missing is just going to be compounded if we don't address some of these other issues. Because I'm actually speaking and communicating with a young woman right now in New York City with suspected cancer who can't even get somebody to see her and get the screening that she needs because she's on Medicaid. So it's definitely not just socioeconomic, but it's you can't get people to see the research institution as being fair and just if they can't even get to it, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And isn't there a way and I really appreciate what you said about this being a moment about justice, there could be a way where we could address both at the same time. And I don't mean about incentivizing people to participate in research, but that might be a way to do it.
I think your point.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, sorry, Sandy. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I don't mean to cut you off.
No, but I was just kind of, just re-articulating what I thought I didn't re-articulate clearly. So please go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken about the fact that it's not just within research, but even getting care. And you make me think about a series of webinars that we just held about the queer Black type 1 diabetes community, and hearing their perspectives as well. There's a lot of different things and intersectionality happening there, but many of them recounting that they continually were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes because there was a bias there that they didn't have type 1. And it was interesting as well to hear from a perspective as a queer Black individual, especially around their race and ethnicity identity, that they had never seen anybody represented with type 1 diabetes that looked like them. So therefore, it didn't cross their mind either that this was something that could be happening to them. So I think that there's a lot that we can do, even from an educational standpoint, to make sure that there is representation so that patients are able to help sort of be empowered and identify these things. But it doesn't help if then they are being told by their clinicians that, these things aren't happening, this is not what it is. And so, I don't have the answer there, but I think that this is still something that we all need to collectively keep front of mind and figure out ways to continue to combat it. And from the standpoint of talking about these things, of working with patients to help to solve these problems collectively, one of the things that I like to make sure that people are aware of on the industry or professional side is it's okay to not be perfect. That's what I see sometimes as one of the biggest barriers is oh, where to start? What's the perfect patient engagement? And there's not. And I think if you and your organization are at least committed to doing something and then following through and doing the next thing and doing the next thing, then that's a great place to start, because we don't want it to be one and done. You shouldn't just do one patient engagement thing anyways. So just starting somewhere and continuing to learn from it and iterate upon it, that's really the best place and the best way to go about this. But don't get hung up thinking that the perfect engagement is out there.
And I just wanted to also, Cindy, what you're saying is also absolutely true. Part of what we need to do is invest in making it very easy for the patients to actually be able to participate from a economic burden standpoint. Potentially putting more tools in place so they don't have to travel often. Again, some of what Jen has been saying, simple steps that will cost some money. Using more maybe digital tools so we can have more remote monitoring or remote assessments. Again, providing patients with these digital tools, such as a e-diary, an actual device so they can actually use, and they don't have to use their own device. There's so many ways we can actually address some of these barriers that are linked to socioeconomic factors, which are in essence also linked to racism and systemic injustice. So there are ways we can do this. It does require us to invest more in ensuring that some of the needs which we think of now as basic, having a smartphone, are met in these communities.
Thanks. It's hard.
Yeah. Yes, Cindy, I think that is exactly right. It is hard. Thanks for your great question. And these are really important questions that we should continually ask ourselves, because there's always going to be some barrier to access for any group, for any product, for anything. We have to continually ask ourselves, what are those barriers and what can we do as people making these products to do the right thing, and to continually thinking about these questions to make them work. We've got another great question here that was asked anonymously, and I think I can understand that I think is really useful here. So what we talk about with this webinar is that we're going to give tips on how we can all do things, right? Because there's a lot of talking that can be done, but that means nothing unless we do actions, right? But this question here is one that I think we all see a lot. So this question is saying, can we offer any tips about how to progress efforts at our own institutions whenever executive teams refuse to recognize that there are issues within our own ranks? Yum, that is a great question. So let's talk about that. I think this means lots of different things. Maybe if there is, people who don't see see the homogeny within a C-suite as not being something that terribly matters. Or even, people who don't really see, how necessary important it is now to engage a diverse population, right? Budgets, timelines, things that we often hear as reasons that are barriers to really important conversations like this. And I remember, and I've heard, this is a story of a story, so just go along with it. How there was a trial, I think it was a lupus trial, how a friend of Dime was involved to help with that, to help recruit a diverse population for it. This was for some rare forms. So the FDA had allowed them to skip a phase if they could show efficacy markers and those kinds of things and diversity in their patient group. So whenever they had done their trial and submitted to the FDA, they had one Black person on that trial. And the FDA came back and said, okay, so you had one Black person that does not represent the patient group for this therapeutic area that you're doing it. So now you don't get to skip that phase. You have to go back and do your big phase, right? And we know these phases. There's a phase 2 or phase 3 at that point, which is thousands and thousands of people. And so if that company had taken the effort to begin with to create a more equitable clinical trial design, that would have saved the company money that I can't even imagine, much more than money and time, right? And so there's benefits for including people, not even just, because it's the right thing to do. Sometimes I think ethics isn't always the strongest case. There's also a monetary case for that, though. Simply, it helps your product reach more people. But that's a really big question I think is really useful. And so I'd like to hear Rowlett and Jen, any more kind of comments on this question.
Yeah, so this is a tough situation, and especially again in this really pivotal time when many people want to be vocal, and not everyone is in a comfortable position where they can be vocal, and we have to be mindful that not everyone has the luxury to be more active on this topic at work, because it may be a barrier to potentially continue employment, for better or worse, for some people. But this is also a pivotal moment where we do need to utilize the resources internally. So the first thing I would suggest is, if this person does not feel comfortable really, or if there's not a mechanism to present it directly to the executive committee, if there are employee resource groups within that company for which the employee can go to voice these concerns and actually go as a group to the executive committee, because there is strength in numbers in presenting this as an issue. There's also strength in presenting data. There's their data on this in the company? You know, maybe it's not an official company survey that's been done, but there's something informal which provides data on the metrics for the executives to see, because people are often driven by data and what they can actually perceive. So that will be important in being able to lead that change, because on one hand, we can't say there's not diversity without actually being able to sometimes quantify it, and then quantifying the impact of that lack of diversity, have projects being affected. And I know it is several more steps to take, but this is the time when I think there is some energy in making some major changes, especially corporate energy. So I do think that providing this data and being able to provide this data and have this effort as a group would be the best approach. Because I think maybe staying silent right now is the path of least resistance, but it's also the path that allows us not to be able to affect any movement within our ranks. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that would be my advice.
I'm reminded of John Lewis about causing good trouble.
That's right. It's time to cause good trouble.
Yeah. There was a question here, just I think in general. Jen, there's been a lot of interest in the Savvy white paper that you mentioned. How can folks access that? Is there a button on your site? Is there an email address?
Yes, you can certainly email is probably the easiest way than to try to speak out the URL, but you can email us at, well, you can email me directly, Jen, Jen, at savvy.coop. That's savvy.coop. It's amazing how many people misspell savvy with 2 A's. It's 2 V's. And I'm happy to send that over to you and can just send that directly so you don't have to download it.
There's a really interesting question here in the chat that I think it's a tough one, but that's the whole reason that we're here, right? And this might be our last question since we're coming up, and it'll be a big one, I think. So this question is a really important one. How can we challenge providers and research institutions to evaluate their contributions to widening the gap of healthcare disparities in ways that they can actively mediate that and implement them at their organization? It's a big question. And I think it's a question that I think a lot of groups wouldn't care to do. I don't think a lot of groups would like to show that their products or their access actually widens the gap, right? But the fact that there might not be research that shows that from them, but is actually something that is still very important. And so instead of maybe looking at how maybe like one hospital group widens gaps of health access, we can take a step back. Instead of talking about that hospital group, maybe look at that. I'm reminded of my time whenever I was living in St. Louis, Missouri, how there is the Del Mar divide. Del Mar is a street in St. Louis where south of it is, well, rich and white, north is poor and black. And it is well established. I mean, the BBC reported on it, my goodness, reporting on Missouri, it's a big thing. And so there's a lot of health disparities in that city alone. And there's also a couple major hospital groups there, one really big research hospital, a few, but one of them is very big. And so engaging with those kinds of different groups to show what are the work that you are doing to, instead of asking how do they widen the gap, instead challenge them and maybe say, how is it that you make the gap smaller? I think kind of maybe changing those conversations into a way that's a little bit less shameful makes the conversation a lot more accessible. I think it doesn't hide the fact that there's a lot of things that actually make it difficult, you know, even things like being able to pay for treatment, accessing treatment, I think are things that of course widen the gap from really immediate logistical ways. But it is a very important question, and one that we continue to do to challenge ourselves, our work, our personal beliefs, the way that who we work with, the teams that we work with, in kinds of different ways. Rowlett, Jen, any comments on that big question?
Well, I certainly don't have an answer, but something that's bubbling up for me thinking about that conversation and what you were just sharing was even just thinking about how we're handling the pandemic right now. And here in New York City, obviously we're hit extremely hard. We already know the disparities, but thinking about public and private hospitals and just the system issues there, and the fact that, I was hearing the statistics about what was the nurse to patient ratio in public hospitals versus private hospitals, of course, access to beds and everything like that. And one of the tragic things that I was hearing was that there, were many more beds available in these private hospitals than the public hospitals, and only 50 patients were transferred during the pandemic. Out of all the needs that were happening in the public hospitals here in New York City, only 50 were transferred. And it goes back to incentives, right? Because it's all about the economics of it. Those public hospitals need to be able to, get some sort of, economic benefit from treating these patients. And most of them are more Medicaid, Medicare. And so the private hospitals, are less incentivized to take them. And they weren't turning people away, but it was this sort of tension between trying to change that care. So, I don't have an issue, or I don't have an answer. I have lots of issues, but I don't know how to answer that question. I think a lot of it is systemic changes that, unfortunately, it's kind of like they all have to sort of be solved in this like puzzle. And as an innovator, I've always been told, like, look at the problems and see if there's like one larger problem that can help you solve some of the smaller ones so that you don't have to do them all individually. So I think if we can sort of take a step back and start to look at it from a wider lens and start to see, okay, if we solve this aspect of it, does that help to make sure that some of the other things are more equitably solved as well?
This is a tough question because, we are, as humans, we're very poor at being able to reflect on ourselves and to kind of evaluate our flaws. And sometimes we don't even think anything's wrong, or we can make excuses and say, well, this is just the way it is. So this is why I think that's why external pressure is important. It's important for us as citizens, as maybe local governments, as patient groups, whatever, to be able to demand transparency in these organizations, to set new standards, to say, this is what we require in terms of reporting. This is what we want to see, and then we want to know how you plan to mitigate some of these concerning areas regarding the health disparities that you may be creating as an organization. So it's not easy. It's going to require that we as citizens really actually push for this type of systemic level change. And we're getting there, but we just have to require a higher standard from the brands we use. We just have to require them to be able to more effectively show that they are making these efforts, especially when it comes to providers and hospitals in terms of the patient care that they're providing. I think this is important, and it's not a question that's going to be, or an issue that's going to be resolved overnight, but it's going to be part of a larger change that can be implemented over the years to come.
Well said, Rowlett. I agree completely, and I appreciate you ending this with a little bit of hope for us. We can all do this together. We can all take baby steps together. We take a big step, and we can continue walking. Well, so we're coming up the end of the hour. Rowlett Abdullahi, Jen Horenjeff, thank you so much for your time today and for helping and for working with this fantastic conversation. Thank you for everyone on the line for making time today to join this conversation live. It is a big conversation. It's a hard one, but it's a very important one. So thank you everyone for your time today. And if you're looking for more DIME content, all we got here at DIME is content. And so next week, we were talking about earlier how diversity of teams matters, but it can be really hard to source those diverse teams. And just in time, we've got a whole webinar about that next week, where we talk about the importance of sourcing diverse expertise in healthcare innovation and how diversity helps your product and also helps you do something much more equitable. Where we'll have Shelley Pavone from Enlightened, Diane Bryson from Inspired Health Strategies, And then we have Kevin Ban from Walgreens. And then we also have more content, of course, because we're Dime. And so we've got, at the week after that, our journal club about how the world is handling the pandemic, because of course the pandemic isn't just America, and Dime isn't just for America. Let's think about how other countries are also reacting to the pandemic. But with that, we're at the hour. Thank you again to everyone, especially Rowlett and Jen. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.